Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning to our audience in the United States. Good evening to our audience in Korea. Welcome to our program today at the CSIS Korea Chair. We hope that everyone, at least in the U.S., had a good long weekend, giving thanks as we enter the holiday season. My name is Victor Cha. I'm the Senior Vice President and Korea Chair at CSIS and Professor at Georgetown University. I'm also Director of the Washington Research Consortium on Korea at CSIS, which you will learn a lot about in the next couple of hours. Today we will discuss issues related to North Korea in the context of our Washington Research Consortium on Korea. For those of you who are not familiar with this consortium is a 5-year project conducted by CSIS with the support of a grant from the Academy of Korean Studies. The consortium's research involved 9 scholars in the U.S. and Korea, who I will introduce in a moment. The consortium's research is focused on deciphering the so-called black box that is North Korea. Our scholars used multidisciplinary research methods to gain new and unique insights about the country, the regime, and its people. The fields of study included social history, diplomatic history, strategy and national security, data collection and analysis, postmodern concepts of statehood and methods of state control, evolving concepts of citizenship and identity, domestic politics, and the impact of markets, transnational networks, and new sources of information on society. These areas of study constitute new approaches to addressing the issue of North Korea, and the work that has been and will continue to be produced in this consortium, which is an astounding 5 books and 15 journal articles, constitute a corpus of scholarly literature that looks at North Korea not as a static whole, but as a highly complicated and interrelated set of challenges that pose problems from regional stakeholders in a globalized world. This multi-year research project started in 2016 and concludes at the end of this year. The consortium was made possible by CSIS and the support of the Korean Studies Promotion Service of the Academy of Korean Studies. And the scholars want to thank AKS for its support that allowed us to work on this project. As I mentioned a minute ago, 9 scholars were composed of the project. I personally have been very happy to work with such a wonderful group of scholars and friends. We definitely had our challenges, most notably the COVID-19 pandemic limited our ability to convene as a group to review each other's work. We were unable to gather as a group at a panel that we had featured at the ISA in Hawaii, but we made do with several sessions by Zoom instead. So now allow me to introduce the members of the consortium who are really the stars of today's show. Joining us for panel 1 is Bridget Coggins. She's an associate professor of political science at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Bridget is also a senior advisor to our CSIS Next Gen Scholars Program with USC. John Delury is professor of Chinese Studies at the Yonsei University Graduate School of International Studies, where he serves as chair of the program on international cooperation. He is also chair of the undergraduate program in international studies at Yonsei's Underwood International College, and founding director of the Yonsei Center on Oceania Studies. I did not know that last fact. And then joining us as the third panelist is Seongho Shin. He is professor of international security in East Asia and former dean of the Office of International Affairs at Seoul National University. In addition to his role as professor, he has advised various government organizations, including the South Korean Ministry of National Defense, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Unification, and Committee on Foreign Affairs and Unification in the South Korean National Assembly. I will introduce our guests for panel 2 later, but let me also say that members of the consortium who were unable to join us today due to various scheduling dilemmas include Michael Green, who is Senior Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair at CSIS and Director of Asian Studies at Georgetown, Van Jackson, who is a Senior Lecturer in International Relations at the Victoria University of Wellington, and Catherine Moon, who is a Professor of Political Science and the Wasserman Chair of Asian Studies at Wellesley. Normally, we would have brought all of these scholars to Seoul for a wrap-up conference featuring the research that has been done, but alas, we are resigned to doing this by Zoom. So that's just a short introduction. As you can see, we brought together scholars from Korea, from the United States, from as far as New Zealand, to work on various aspects related to the black box of North Korea. And so in our first session, for the first hour, we're going to speak with Bridget, Seongho, and John. And I would like to start by first asking you each to give a very brief summary of one piece of work. A number of you have written multiple works for this consortium, but if you could just give a brief summary of one piece of work that you are doing related to the project. It could be something that you've already finished or something that you're continuing to work on. Just a short summary so that our audience can get some sense of substantively of some of the work that you all have been doing. So why don't we start with Bridget?
Okay. Hi. Thank you, Victor, and thank you for having us all to discuss this work. One of my favorite parts of being an academic is convening to talk about work and share ideas, and so this has been incredibly frustrating not to be with everyone. And I had very much hoped to be in Seoul right now, so I'm jealous of my co-panelists. So just a quick 5 minutes. My way of opening the black box that is North Korea, or kind of peering into that black box, is to look at innovative methods of finding out about North Korea for fundamentally important security questions, and especially regarding instability and stability in North Korea. So I have two different pieces of that. The first is, how is North Korean weapons proliferation affected by its stability or instability, and or regime stability or insecurity? And the second, which I'm going to talk about a bit more today in depth, is how will North Korean civilians respond to dramatic instability or regime insecurity in North Korea, if that is to occur? And so specifically, what would the scale, I'm interested in what the scale or pace and nature of human flight might be for civilians that are facing dire effects as a result of instability within North Korea. So who will cross borders into China and South Korea, and under what kinds of instability scenarios? So as you might all know, and you probably certainly all know, answering this question is critical to, number one, understanding how conflict dynamics might unfold on the Korean Peninsula, anticipating them. And it's also, I think, something that is less paid attention to is it's essential for governmental and non-governmental humanitarian security questions, right? If it is going to be necessary to get a lot of aid to border zones, well, one of the things that we're finding with migration right now in and across Europe and near the post-Soviet space is how do you get that kind of critical infrastructure and planning in place so that you can anticipate humanitarian needs? So those are the two things that are critical for answering this question. And in North Korea, we don't expect to have access to one of the most critical drivers of these kinds of human flight, And that is in its internal politics, right? And so the research results and estimates of flight to date have been very superficial or vague or based on very scant or limited evidence. And so in my research, my team and I have taken on the wealth of information that we do know about North Korea. Population demographics, geography, topography, its roads and rail systems, wealth, health and well-being, mobility, family size, borders, natural or otherwise. And with that information, we've built a dynamic computer model, what's called an agent-based model, that can simulate using a number of different measures of stability and instability scenarios, what human flight might be likely to result in those situations. And we built that model using special North Korean characteristics, but using what we do know from other cases of instability and civil war and the kinds of things that motivate human flight in those situations, where they create refugees, where they create internally displaced people. And we also leverage past instances of instability, and notably the arduous March period in the mid-1990s in North Korea, to help us to get a better grasp on population dynamics as well. So what do we find? What are the top line findings? Well, we find two different important things. And the first is that the scale and pace of a potential refugee problem on the North Korean border with China is much smaller than many of the point estimates to date that have been made. So we expect that China could very successfully and capably deal with any refugee problem that might result on its side of the border. The scale and pace of North Korean refugees should not be so dramatic and fast that it would be incapable. The second thing that we find is that internal displacement would be a far larger problem than existing estimates, and especially prominent research by American think tanks might have anticipated. And that's because we have incorporated the internal dynamics and we know a bit more about how countries and populations, like the North Korean population that has been inured to very difficult and precarious socioeconomic circumstances for a very long time, might react to regime instability. So that's larger than is typically estimated, if it is discussed at all when it comes to these kinds of refugee scenario planning. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Bridget, for that very interesting work, and I'm sure that we'll have some questions about that. Why don't we go now to Professor Shin Seongho, who is joining us from South Korea. Both Shin, Seongho, and John are joining us from South Korea. So thank you for joining us so late. So, Seongho.
So yes, good morning in the DC or in Washington, and good evening here in Seoul at the moment. First of all, it's good to be with you again, and yeah, I'm very sorry that you couldn't make it to Seoul as we were planning just until a couple of months ago. But at the moment, given the situation is with the new kind of virus over the world, maybe it's safe to be on this virtual event yet, I guess. I've been working on this project, focusing on how to deal with obviously North Korea's nuclear weapon, and how to negotiate with North Korea as a kind of a security specialist. So I have two projects. That one that I have finished, already published in Korean Journal of Defense Analysis, and my second project I'm at the moment currently working on. And speaking of my already the first one, that was try to compare the U.S. coercive diplomacy dealing with North Korea's Kim Jong-un between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. And as you can see, these two president or administration maybe, give us a kind of best example of two very different approach in dealing with this same problem under the very two different president. And in doing so, I try to apply kind of very, traditional theory of coercive diplomacy by Alexander George, and also more recent work done by Bruce Gentleson about the Libyan case, and try to combine those two analytical framework of these two scholars into comparing how this Obama's strategy and or versus Mr. Trump's strategy did or didn't work in dealing with Kim Jong-un and their negotiation strategy. And to sum it up, in case of Obama, we all know that his approach was based upon strategic patience versus Mr. Trump's kind of big deal, approach in dealing with North Korea. And obviously, we had very different kind of dynamics and outcome between these two American presidents and their counterpart Kim Jong-un. And what was the difference when it comes to strategic patience? We all know that basically for 8 years of Obama president, basically nothing happened between US and North Korea, and North Korea continuing with its nuclear weapon. Whereas in case of Mr. Trump, quite interestingly, he had two summit, if you will, maybe including the last meeting at the Panmunjom 3 meeting with Kim Jong-un. And they had a certain kind of agreement, basic agreement about at least in rhetoric, kind of denuclearizing relation pledged by the Kim Jong-un. So why there's such a different outcome from or response from the North Korean regime? And in that sense, I say, first of all, there's some obviously difference in their approach in dealing with them. And I use, for example, using the framework of Bruce Gentleson's proportionality of acknowledging North Korean regime as a legitimate party for negotiation. And in that, both Obama and Trump in that had a kind of similar position when they say they didn't try to at least send a signal that they are up for the regime change, which was the kind of under the George Bush administration. The second framework, the criteria of when it comes to coercive credibility, that when United States said that there will be a price to pay if you don't do any accept my demand, and Obama's strategic patience, which was a kind of a gradual turning the screw strategy by the Alexander George, it didn't create enough kind of sense of urgency to the North Korean regime, whereas Trump's the early rhetoric of completely destroying the North Korea, even using nuclear weapon and all kinds of things, created enough urgency to the Kim Jong-un regime, which raised America's kind of credibility when it comes to its own threat of punishment. The third criteria of reciprocity, which was talking about, is not only the pressure, you also have to provide certain kind of reward. In other words, the carrot and stick approach. In that criteria, again, President Obama's didn't, it seems like, provide enough incentive for Kim Jong-un to come to the negotiation table with a serious kind of incentive and intention. Whereas Mr. Trump, simply by suggesting and providing, actually meeting with Kim Jong-un itself was such a huge reward for Kim Jong-un regime, who was dying almost to, seeking for U.S. kind of recognition of Kim Jong-un as a kind of worthy party of this one of the most, the most powerful nation, the leader of the United States, meeting with him in person. That in and itself provided huge kind of incentive maybe for Kim Jong-un. So that's how in combination of all this, it created enough urgency, at the same time incentive for Kim Jong-un to come out at least to meet with Mr. Trump, which was not the case of President Obama. So these are the kind of my conclusion. But at the end of the day, of course, all those two different approaches didn't work out. It didn't eventually accomplish the denuclearization objective from the U.S. perspective. But anyway, those are the kind of some lesson and comparison that I try to apply and analyzing. Maybe it could have some future implication for the Biden administration's approach to North Korea, as they are trying to also again another round of nuclear negotiation diplomacy with Pyongyang. Let me stop here.
Great, thank you, Seongho. Thank you very much for telling us about some of the projects that you've been working on. The next one we'll go to for research summary is John Delury. John?
Yeah, well, thanks, Victor. And just to echo everyone else, this has been a great project. I've really treasured being part of this group. And we shift now from political science and international relations to history, which I guess was part of your purpose in gathering us together, as you said, a sort of multidisciplinary approach. So I did a few pieces for the project, but the one maybe I'd start with, Victor, was it's actually not out yet. So this is a teaser here. Everyone can race off to the website of the Journal of Cold War Studies and keep updating until the article drops. But I was really intrigued. Obviously, my background is in China, and I've sort of come to North Korea via China. So I use this as an opportunity to dig deeper into that relationship. In a way, it's kind of putting the black box next to the gray box and see what happens. And so it's a sort of classic diplomatic history piece where the anchor of it is a moment really in 1980 where there's this interesting contradiction that I saw between what was happening in China, which is going through the post-Mao transition into the Deng era. And that summer of 1980, Deng Xiaoping unleashes this sort of small campaign against feudalism. And so that becomes one of the buzzwords of the year of combating feudalism. This came up recently because as part of that campaign, there was the constitutional revision that set the term limits on the Chinese presidency, which of course Xi Jinping got rid of in 2018. So that was a very interesting point to look more deeply into, particularly because of the contradiction formed with later in that year, October, at the 6th Korean Workers' Party Congress, where essentially Kim Il-sung coronates his son, Kim Jong-il, sort of the ultimate act of feudalism. So it was that ideological contradiction that I wanted to look at and sort of probe the tensions between China and North Korea. And I think, what I was trying to do, although it's a straight history approach, I think part of my motivation was having observed, as we all did, the pretty extraordinary open tensions of 2017 between Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping. I wanted to sort of take a historical baseline measure and look at an earlier moment of fairly intense tensions, and to just sort of, in my own mind, get a better understanding of how to contextualize what we see more recently. And in terms of methodology, what I ended up doing, again, this is sort of the black box or two black box approach. I relied primarily on the state media reports coming out of simultaneously out of Pyongyang and Beijing, and and obviously these are tightly controlled, especially on a topic like this, state media outlets, and that actually gave me the opportunity to look for discrepancies in terms of the reporting on the Chinese side versus the North Korean side. And so, any delays or differences, things mentioned in Norong Shinmun and not mentioned in Renmin Ribao and the People's Daily and vice versa, I sort of jumped on those and tried to develop an interpretation basically out of the gaps in the reporting. And lastly, I would say, as a historian, you don't really have to prove anything. There's no N. Things just happen, and you try to figure out what happened. So that really was, at the end of the day, what it was about. That research. But I guess I would say, if I tried to draw a broader conclusion, what I saw, which I do think is a pattern in that very peculiar relationship, is that you could see these tensions if you know, especially how to read the state media. I don't think I was inventing it. They're there. They were not as out in the open as 2017. So I do think it shows how bad the relationship was in 2017. But the other thing is, what I couldn't find, and it's possible it's hidden in the archives, I couldn't find evidence of kind of resolving the tension. Instead, it was more like Deng Xiaoping and the leadership in China, and he was grooming his successors, and then Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and the North Korean leadership, they just sort of absorbed these tensions and grit their teeth and moved on to sort of the next set of tensions. So what I couldn't see was resolution or kind of learning, growing, and to me, that speaks to the way in which that alliance, I do think it's an alliance relationship, is a very tense one. And one without a lot of growth, but that also, in a way, has this strange resilience. It can absorb a tension that maybe we would expect would break apart other alliance relationships. So for me, that was the takeaway, if there's any.
Great, thanks, John. So terrific summary of. I know that all of you are doing different and a number of works for the project, but thanks for summarizing some of them. All of you, in some respects, with your projects, are dealing with questions of North Korean resilience, whether it's domestic resilience, whether it's resilience with regard to the relationship with China, historically or currently. So I wanted to shift the conversation to looking at questions of North Korean stability in 2021 and how you assess that these days. I know that John, and some of your, in addition to the Journal of Cold War History project, you've also written some for Asian Survey, the year ender, or the beginning of the year, Asian Survey pieces on North Korea in 2020, North Korea in 2021. I don't know if you're doing North Korea in 2022, but if you were to write something now, or maybe you've already thought about this, what do you think would be the main story if we talked about North Korea in 2021?
Oh, thanks, Victor. That's a great question. And yeah, very briefly on those, I did do two. The two was enough. I retired, but it was a great exercise. Those are wonderful. I've used those before. They're very useful. Those year enders that Asian Survey does for many countries in the region. And so I really enjoyed doing those as kind of practice, what was important in 2019 and in 2020. And those were relatively quiet years. I'm glad I didn't have to do 2017 and 2018. It was in a way easier, although by 2020, and this gets to your question, it was getting hard to figure out what to say because it was getting so quiet. And our sources of information, which are, again, to the black box title of our project, our sources are always, of course, highly constrained and limited. But even that limited pool was really drying up. Things like a diplomatic community, NGO community, humanitarian groups, who certainly I think we all take opportunities you can to chat with folks off the record or whatever, or read things that are written up. And you do get some sense of how things are going on the ground. Obviously, there's been so much interest from the outside to understand where is North Korea with COVID, which basically I'm waiting for the expert who really knows. I haven't found anyone who actually knows. We have a lot of educated guesswork and that kind of thing. So the by the end of 2020, and I think this is probably what I'd be writing about and grappling with now, is almost a meta article about this issue of the black box, and how under these conditions, you actually learn to appreciate the sources you do have in quote unquote normal times before COVID, when there were more defectors coming out and going back in, or you had more of an information flow with groups here. You had the diplomatic community, the NGO community, and that's essentially all gone. So that's probably I have a feeling, the title of the piece would be something epistemological. Whereas the other one in previous years, I did feel I could draw some straight, descriptions of, obviously in 2020, the focus I called the piece In Search of Health and Power, because of the all-consuming focus on combating COVID. There was no pretense that it doesn't exist. North Korea was one of maybe the first country, even arguably before China, to seal its border and treat it with extreme seriousness. So that was the central issue really in 2020, and I think it would be much harder to try and do justice to this year.
Great, thanks. Thanks, John. Let me go now to Dr. Coggins and ask you, Bridget, very interesting research, this project that you've done trying to map and predict what movement would look like in North Korea in the event of some sort of instability. If we take that question more and scope it out even more broadly, what would be the indicators based on your research with regard to whether there was actual instability in the regime? You said that we wouldn't see the sorts of flows outside of the country into China, but where there would be a lot of movement would be inside the country. And so would that be like the primary indicator, or how would you look at this whole question of instability based on the research you've done?
Thanks, Victor. I think that one of the things that has come to me, maybe too gradually, but one of the things that has come to me in doing work on North Korea is something that you and your team at CSIS, using satellite imagery, and Dr. Chestnut-Greitens and some of the work that she's doing on kind of what kind of signals are there that the North Korean regime does not control? What can we look at that is data that is not produced by North Korea itself? Because there are so many ways in which things are controlled within the North Korean state. And when it comes to international relations data, external data, we're almost always relying on the state. And in cases where we're not relying on the state to give us data, we're relying on non-governmental organizations and third-party institutions that in the North Korean case are not active, or in this most recent couple of years have been specifically pushed out of the country or barred from re-entering the country, right? And so I think that one of the things that we would want to look at to know whether or not there is a significant amount of regime stability are we starting to see uncontrolled population movement within the country in a way that we hadn't before? As you know, movement within the country is also very closely restricted and regulated. And so if we did start to see population movement that was unanticipated and in a more or less systematic way than what we might expect were some policy of the regime itself, then I would say that would be a good external indicator that's not controlled by the Kim regime itself that we could look to.
Interesting. Well, in terms of internal movement, what did your model show in terms of how where was the movement moving? Was it moving to the big cities, or what sort of movement did you see? Did you guys find?
So one of the nice things about a computer simulation model is that you can run 100 or 1,000 different scenarios. And so what we have started doing, I mean, we will retain the model and we can use it to make it as complex as we like, or change it as time goes on. Well, one of the things that we thought was very important is if there was a conflict that was centered in Pyongyang, what would happen to, as you know, much of the population is concentrated there, and the wealthy and powerful are also concentrated there. And so what we looked at was a small conflict there, and compared that to something that was longer term and larger. And what we saw in a small conflict and a concentrated conflict is people disperse, but then they return pretty much as soon as it's done, because it's the violence that drives people away. And that's what we see in other conflict scenarios in other places too, where there's, for example, a coup or a coup d'etat or some other kind of palace intrigue. In longer term conflict, what we saw was much longer term displacement and movement, at least from Pyongyang, towards places like Dandong, and movement toward the border with South Korea, the DMZ.
Interesting. Very interesting. Okay, Seongho, let's go to you. I mean, in your work on coercive diplomacy, I wondered the extent to which you looked at this question that it's increasingly looking like we're going to be living with a nuclear North Korea for the foreseeable future, despite the stated policy of complete and irreversible denuclearization. First, one, what do you think about that? And two, what are the implications of this for diplomacy?
Yes, in fact, that's a kind of one of my second part of a project that I'm working on, because I ended with my first project as a conclusion. Despite all these two different approach, what they have is, yes, still North Korean nuclear program is going on. Kim Jong-un is keeping his own nuclear weapon. And there should be no kind of wishful thinking about this. As like you said, there's, I think, kind of wide agreement, consensus among both in Washington and Seoul, in the other part of the world, that no matter what Kim Jong-un, for Kim Jong-un to give up his nuclear weapon, that is one of the most important guarantee of his regime survival. It's not going to be easy, right? So we all know. So that's why you just raised that question. Then how we deal with or live with this kind of semi-nuclear power North Korea. And then we need to again deep dive into what is their nuclear intention. At the same time, both capability. And obviously, over the past years and decades, if not decade, there has been some lots of research about North Korea's nuclear intention or their capability, as they test so many nuclear weapons at the same time, missile and all those things. And I found that there is a kind of too much of a wide variety of assessment from very much kind of North Korea has all kinds of this nuclear weapon capability, and they can threaten the United States, hitting the Washington D.C. and all those major cities in the United with its ICBM capability. But those, I mean, you have to always think about the worst case scenario, but still that's a kind of little bit of too much of over interpretation of North Korea's nuclear capability. Yet at the same time, we should not underestimate their weapon capability or provocative intention. So we need to find a kind of balance in between. So that's what I'm trying to, what could be the kind of connection between their real intention and their weapon capability, including all those missile capability, and try to have a more realistic assessment first, and then we can come up with how to deter or deal with those North Korea's weapon capability. And I mean, there is I know lots of debate going on about this is really mainly for the deterrence purpose, or this is also for very aggressive coercive purpose. And based on those different assessment, you need there's also different kind of response or suggestion about how to deal with those. What is the best deterrence strategy against those North Korea's nuclear weapon capability? But recently, especially in this giving South Korea's ongoing presidential campaign, there is an interesting debate coming out within South Korea, saying that can we really trust U.S. extended deterrence against this increasing North Korea's nuclear capability? And one of the extreme, kind of a wild case scenario among some of those Korean politicians, for example, is that maybe South Korea need to develop our own nuclear capability. I think that's a kind of very dangerous kind of area that we could fall into if we emphasize too much about kind of capability. We overestimate North Korea's nuclear capability or intention. So this is a kind of my second work, trying to to assess how to strike a balance between North Korea's rhetoric and their nuclear intention and their real capability. That's kind of what I've been working on. But I guess going back to your first question, I guess Biden administration came up with kind of a pragmatic and calibrated approach to North Korea. What that is, how to deal with North Korea. I think eventually they have to find some way in between Obama and Trump's approach. But bottom line is they need to talk to Kim Jong-un again.
Thanks, Seongho. You mentioned the South Korean elections and politicians being among the people where we've heard this talk about questions about U.S. extended deterrence, given the unlikely scenario that North Korea will denuclearize anytime soon. Is there any data on the extent to which that view is, where that sits on the political spectrum, and has that changed over time? Because I know there's certain people that view had been associated with, but I guess the question is, has it moved? Is it still isolated to that particular pocket of the South Korean political spectrum, or has that changed?
Yes. One thing is that among these two presidential candidates or camp, quite ironically, the opposition party, which traditionally is for U.S. ROK alliance and conservative faction, these are the camp that there is a voices for kind of such a kind of South Korea's nuclear armament, whereas the governing party candidate or current government, the liberal progressive group of Korean party political spectrum, they tend to say no, we shouldn't go to that dangerous path. We should still try to nuclear negotiation and all kinds of things. And but at the same time, I guess even among those conservative, I think those who are telling about the South Korea's nuclear weapon development is still remains to be very minor voices. But at the same time, with this nuclear negotiation between U.S. and North Korea is not going anywhere, in complete impasse. And while at the same time, there's a kind of public awareness about growing North Korea's nuclear capability. There's one of the recent poll done by the Asan Institute, one of the think tank in Korea, they said that 70% of South Korean public say that maybe we should develop our own nuclear weapon capability. Of course, it fluctuates. When there's a better inter-Korean relation or better, dialogue, conversation between U.S. and North, those support for kind of nuclear armament goes down, like 50% or 40%. But at the same time, if really nothing happens in this nuclear negotiation front, obviously the pressure for kind of both for Korean public and politician to do something about this North Korean nuclear program will build up. And who knows, in some day you may have a very really serious debate about South Korea. But at the same time, those people are also talking about redeployment of U.S. Tactical nuclear weapon into South Korea or nuclear co-sharing. So there are various different debate going on at the moment, but that debate is happening in Korea right now.
Great, thanks, Seongho. Let me go to John and step back from the question of extended deterrence and discussions of nuclearization in South Korea to more broadly the Moon government's record. I mean, you live in Seoul. You're one of the leading public commentators on this. I mean, how would you assess the Moon government? We're now entering December. They've got a few months left in office. 5 years of really intense efforts with North Korea, arguably their most important priority. Some might say even more important than domestic issues, or at least the view of some in South Korea. I mean, how would you assess the overall record, given the effort that's been put in, what accomplishments were made, and how would you, as professor, how would you grade the policy?
Well, now that everything is online, my whole theory of grading has changed, so I might not give a grade. It's a great question. It's very hard when you're still in the middle of it. I do think about that. I think about how will historians in 10, 20, 30 years look back on the Moon years. I mean, living through it now, my guess is it's going to be about COVID. And pretty skillfully, not necessarily Moon himself, but making the right decisions in terms of empowering the right people and having an administrative state that can handle it and a society that makes good decisions. So I sort of think that's probably actually going to be what it's mostly about, even though that's not really what we talk about. It's sort of assumed, yeah, they've done a good job on that. But on North Korea, Victor, I think that we all lived through 2017. Moon played his part, and I think he'll get credit for helping. I think it was Kim Jong-un more, but Moon Jae-in clearly played, in my view, a catalyst role in turning things, using Pyeongchang Olympics, giving Trump the space to do what he wanted to do, which was to directly engage, which in my view was the right move. So Moon was instrumental in kind of that whole shift, and things were getting pretty scary, as we all know, late 2017. And so I think history will be charitable there. 2018, obviously, hopes got really high, and the process then fell apart after basically a year, not even a full calendar year. And since then, Moon has clearly trying to claw some way back to it. I think at this point he's hoping the moonshot is one last summit, and actually I would not at all count that off. Discount the possibility of that, but that of course won't achieve anything in its substance. So, I think the answer, this is how history often works. A lot of the answer to how Moon is judged is going to depend on who wins the election in March and where things go from there. And that's a whole black box. You can barely, I can't follow what the two main candidates are saying. And so that's very hard to predict, so I think if either of the candidates kind of build on the legacy of 2018, of the good work they did with the CMA, the confidence building, the sort of in the weeds, pragmatic stuff, then I think it will redound to Moon's credit. But if things go in a different way, it gets harder to assess. So yeah, I think the past may depend on the future.
Spoken like a true historian.
Not answer the question.
No, that's actually quite insightful. We've got some questions from the audience that I'd like to see if we can get to. And the first one I'd like to go to is one that's for Dr. Kajans, and it's from Bangladesh. This is what's so great about Zoom. And the question for Bridget is, thank you for your insightful presentation. Do you think that in the event of an exodus of North Korean refugees into China, the Xi Jinping government is likely to treat these displaced people harshly?
I think yes. I mean, and the reason why I think so is their demonstrated treatment of so-called North Korean defectors harshly. I think that unless the regime is convinced that treating them in some other way is a more successful way of managing both the kind of real problem, real humanitarian and security problems that would come along the border, but also the alliance relationship with its most problematic ally, unless it's convinced that there are other ways of more successfully dealing with those two issues. I think that the result is likely to be more of the same. And I think that that's tragic and horrible for the North Korean population, who is, number one, already very much struggling in terms of health and society and politics as a result of a regime that many, if not the vast majority of them, did not choose. And also, given a conflict environment, those needs and requirements would be all the more acute for that population. And so I think that for all of us in the international community that talk about human rights in North Korea and talk about the well-being of North Koreans when we're talking about why more sanctions are important, for example, or holding fast on sanctions is important. We should also, at the very least, simultaneously be making real and concrete humanitarian capacity plans for these populations and trying very, very ardently to reach these people who are at the moment beyond our help.
Thanks. Bridget, just a quick follow-up. You mentioned that so you can, in this model that you've developed, you can run different scenarios, and you addressed one of them earlier, which was some sort of conflict inside of Pyongyang. Is there another that you can give us an example of that you had interesting findings from, another type of scenario that you ran in the model?
So the biggest change, I think the biggest and most interesting shift that we saw in refugee and displacement movement came with whether or not the DMZ was open or closed. So it has been the case that China has been hardening somewhat its border with North Korea over the past decade and a half. And that will remain kind of closed, but only relatively closed, depending upon whether or not it's at a river crossing or that sort of thing. There are more porous and less porous situations. But the DMZ is a very, very hard border, and it's a very militarized border. And it's not just on land, it's even out into sea, as we well know. But there are 3 crossing points that are at least potential crossing points where people could cross and pass into South Korea, were there the capacity and the political will to accept people crossing the borders in large numbers. The population of South Korea, or of South Korea, is concentrated in the north. And the population of North Korea is concentrated towards the south. And so that makes it a very interesting political question, but also humanitarian capacity planning for Seoul. Do you attempt to open the borders in order to allow refugees or really Koreans, right, to pass into the cities in the north. Or not. And what we see is that the population pretty quickly figures out over time in these scenarios that there are border crossings that are open, and that the especially long journey from the East Coast maybe to the West Coast, where in Jilin and Dandong, becomes much more possible to move to South Korea just across the DMZ for those people. And so we do see larger numbers siphon in that direction.
Thanks. Very interesting stuff. Next question, we have time maybe for one more question, and this one isn't directed to anybody in particular, but I think it should go to Seongho. And that is the question is, how would you discuss the high degree of attention the Trump administration assigned to summit meetings with North Korea and the lack of public attention to North Korean relations by the Biden administration? What conclusions do you draw regarding the appropriate U.S. policy towards the North?
Yeah, I think that was the very important point that, in dealing with North Korea, Kim Jong-un holds the key. Whether the situation is good or bad, he's the one in a strong position. He's the one who makes all the decisions. So I think U.S. need to recognize, and which Mr. Trump did. At the same time, I know the American dilemma that we tried this, but how can we trust his word and all kind of stuff? So we need to have a kind of concrete discussion and about all the terms and conditions about meeting at also certain nuclear negotiation, all that. But that kind of approach alone will not work. Somehow, U.S. need to find a way to connect with Kim Jong-un again, starting with maybe sending more positive signal, try to recover some of the trust that Kim Jong-un had in between Donald Trump. And I think in that sense, still Mr. Biden, acknowledging the Singapore summit agreement between Kim Jong-un and Trump about not only denuclearization, but also normalizing U.S. DPRK relation along with peace regime on the Korean Peninsula was a right thing to do. And I guess going back to maybe Professor John Delury's point of, maybe President Moon Jae-in at the moment, they are discussing and the war declaration and kinds of last minute kind of effort to connect with North Korea again. Maybe U.S. need to talk to South Korean about how to connect with Kim Jong-un in kind of close coordination between U.S. and South Korea.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to sneak in just one more question for Professor Kajins, which came in from Ewha University, and that is that Bridget, you mentioned that it's important to look at information that or data that North Korea does not control, such as NGO reports for research. However, as we currently don't have many eyes and ears on the ground due to the pandemic, what sources would you consider to be the most reliable for current research on North Korea?
Okay, this is a tough one. And I think that there are a number of different limitations to kind of how much, or maybe the depth and texture of the information that we're ability to gather given the current conditions. But what I do think is important is are a couple of things. The first is paying attention to things that we can see at a distance. Right, patterns and movements and external policies, or the results of external policies, the sort of ripple effects of things that we can see. And there are also creative strategies for data access that different researchers are using. So, for example, something like rice prices within gray markets, right? To see how the actual market is affected rather than the posted prices, right? Which we all know are of very limited utility in telling us what the economic situation is within the country. I personally think too that it's important to look for what's not there, what's missing. So, for example, if it is the case that given North Korea's political situation, that there is data that's really regularly produced for a particular reason with a particular bent in mind to show that maybe people are healthy and doing very well. We can see in the patterns over time the specific manipulation. If we can think about a known bias that might be cooked into those numbers, what is attempting to be communicated or what needs to be downplayed versus upplayed politically. And so I think that the best that we might be able to do with health and well-being in particular is to look at these kind of data forensic tools to try and kind of reason backward about what's trying to be communicated and what that might be hiding, kind of what's not there, what's hidden underneath the numbers that we do have.
Thanks, Bridget. John, did you want to get in on this?
Yeah, just really quickly. It's so interesting. I was really struck by Bridget's comment about looking for data that they don't control. And one thing that strikes me, I mean, I tend to stick more to traditional sources, the texts of the state. Like in my research, I guess you could say North Korea doesn't control Chinese state media. And so finding discrepancies was one way to try and get at something that's going on. But another example that came to my mind listening to Bridget is even in Kim Jong-un's speeches, which I found, I think it was particularly in 2019 when I did the Asian survey piece, were really quite interesting to sit there and sort of systematically read through his speeches over basically the full year. You actually hear him talking about things he can't control and is quite frustrated by. Like there's a lot of anger and frustration in the, these are, by the publication of the state at the Politburo meetings and at his site visits. And so, this issue of what hints of what can't be controlled can, I think, be found, fragments of it in authoritative documents of the state that are basically under the complete control of Kim Jong-un. But I'm very grateful to Bridget. It's a wonderful way for us to think about, how, again, we crack open the black box a little bit.
Well, thanks. Well, one thing we can't control is time, and unfortunately, we're out of it. This was a really fantastic hours discussion on all the very interesting research that you guys have been doing. So I want to thank you all for joining us this morning. Dr. Bridget Kajins, Dr. John Delury, Dr. Shin Seongho. Thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you for participating in the consortium. And we wish you the best of luck with the rest of your research. Again, thank you from Boston and from Seoul. We will now transition to the next panel, and joining us is our two other members of our Washington Consortium. Let me introduce them properly, if that's okay. So I will start with Dr. Sheena Chestnut-Greitens, who is an associate professor at the LBJ School LBJ School of International and Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin, as well as a faculty fellow with the Clements Center for National Security and a distinguished scholar with the Strauss Center for International Security and Law. Dr. Greitens was an assistant professor of political science at the University of Missouri, and I have here that co-director of the university's Institute for Korean Studies, but I think you also founded the Institute for Korean Studies at Missouri, yeah, which is arguably more important than co-directing. So, and then also joining us actually from Manila, if I'm correct, Andrew's still in Manila in the Philippines, is Andrew Yo, who is professor of politics and director of the Asian Studies Center at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. Currently, he's on a leave in Manila in the Philippines. And as some of you, or many of you may know, he will also take up the reins as the new SK Korea Foundation Chair in Korea Studies at the Brookings Institution Center for East Asia Policy Studies. So it's great to have both Dr. Chestnut Greitens and Dr. Yo joining us for the second hour of the panel. So what we did before the previous panel was explain to the audience broadly what we did with this AKS grant and the different projects that people were working on. And I asked the previous group if they could just give us, 5 to 7 minutes about one of the projects that you've been working on under the grant, if that's okay, just so that people have some idea. I know that in both of your cases, you wrote more than one piece for the lab. So if I could go to Dr. Chestnut Greitens first, if you could give us a little summary of some of the work that you've been doing, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Cha, for your leadership on this, to CSIS and to the Academy of Korean Studies. This was just a terrific lab experience, and I really enjoyed the first panel, which I was able to listen to most of. And I think there are some interesting tie-ins to the things that Andrew and I might say today. I did a couple of projects for the lab. One was looking at changes to the North Korean political economy and the rise of basically what we called market Leninism under North Korea, but which is, maybe we can get to a discussion of that when we talk a bit about Andrew's work on markets and state-society relations. But the piece that I wanted to really highlight and introduce is a forthcoming book with Cambridge in the Element series on East Asian society and politics. We're in the process of finalizing the manuscript now. But the book really tries to look at the title of it is The Politics of the North Korean Diaspora. And it really looks at what has happened to North Koreans who have left the DPRK and who have now actually become globally distributed, which is a phenomenon that I encountered when I started doing some research on North Korea and on the North Korean economy, but as part of that research ended up encountering and having really interesting conversations with people who'd left North Korea who were not just in South Korea, but scattered around the world. The largest population of North Korean refugees and defectors is obviously in the ROK. But there are now small communities of North Korean refugees and defectors in the United States, in Canada, in the UK, in Germany, in France, and in Japan as well. And so the book tries, first of all, just to describe what's happening, which is this global dispersion, this emergence of a North Korean diaspora as opposed to the broader Korean global diaspora, has really been formed in the last 20 or so years. And what's interesting about this is we're used to thinking of diasporas in largely ethnic terms, but one of the interesting things that we found was that this group of North Koreans has pretty distinctive migration patterns, has a very distinct sense of political identity, and some unique ways of incorporating in the Western democracies where a lot of these members of the diaspora have ended up. And a lot of that is shaped by two things. First of all is the division of the Korean Peninsula, which has affected where North Koreans who want to leave North Korea can go, right? The availability of South Korean citizenship means many of them are not only allowed, but encouraged or in some cases required to go to South Korea. So the UK has a position now that because South Korea is an available, durable solution for North Koreans, that they must go there rather than claiming asylum or refugee status in the UK. It's not true everywhere. The United States has special legislation, which I know, Dr. Cha, you know very well, the North Korean Human Rights Act, that permits North Koreans who've not gone to South Korea first to resettle in the United States. And actually, just about a month ago, Canada passed made a decision that it would allow a trial program that is somewhat similar to allow North Koreans who've not gone to South Korea first to be sponsored for private resettlement in Canada. It's a very small scale trial program, but could potentially be expanded in the future. And so the first fact that really shapes where this North Korean diaspora has gone is the division and the contested nature of citizenship on the Korean peninsula. But the second factor that really affects members of the diaspora and how they think about North Korea is the fact that North Korea is one of the world's most closed authoritarian regimes. And so the book manuscript goes through not only where people do go and how they incorporate in the Western democracies where they're largely concentrated, again, outside of South Korea and Japan. But it also then looks at the North Korean regime and how it's attempted to manage the emergence of essentially a defector diaspora. During the Cold War, North Korea was able to basically project a diaspora that was organized and sponsored and largely controlled by the state. It was a state-affiliated overseas presence. And what's happened since the 1990s is that an increasing number of North Koreans abroad are not sent there by the regime and sort of don't remain there in order to achieve the goals or the purposes of the North Korean regime. They are either dissidents or people who've escaped for economic and political reasons. And so that change in the nature of the diaspora from about the mid-1990s to present also means that the North Korean regime has changed how it relates to North Koreans abroad. It engages in a lot more surveillance and attempts to discredit defectors who leave, particularly those who are outspoken on human rights advocacy, whether that's at the UN or before the United States Congress or through civil society activism in South Korea with things like balloon launches or attempts to provide information to the people, family, and friends who are remaining in North Korea. And in some cases, that's actually extended to state-sponsored or state-directed assassination and actual attempts to decapitate potential opposition and deter people who remain abroad from engaging in advocacy for human rights or trying to change the situation on the ground inside North Korea. And so the chapter outlines 3 different approaches that the North Korean regime has taken. One is simply to deter people from leaving at all. The second is to discredit North Koreans who have left, who are critical of the regime and its policies. And the third is to decapitate opposition or try to prevent the diaspora that exists from turning into an overseas opposition movement. There's a lot of discussion right now in diaspora studies and the study of migration about when and how diasporas can be an effective voice abroad for internal political change in authoritarian regimes. Diaspora members did play a really important role in the Arab Spring, but in many cases, their roles in advocating for political change in their homeland depended on social media and internet connectivity that doesn't exist in the North Korean case. Right? The North Korean regime has so tightly controlled access to information and the ability of external actors to get information into North Korea. My guess would be that was in part motivated by watching what happened in the Arab Spring and the catalyst that some of these overseas actors played in anti-regime mobilization. We know that North Korea is actively thinking about, and I believe there was a report this summer that they were getting training from the Chinese Ministry of Public Security on how to handle unrest. So this looks like something that they're actively thinking and monitoring, and certainly their behavior toward the diaspora has become increasingly sort of activist in its patterns of surveillance and trying to control what the members of the North Korean diaspora do as political advocates and activists. So the book is really, first of all, trying just to document this phenomenon and document the experiences of these thousands of people who have chosen to leave North Korea and resettle both in the Korean Peninsula, where there's been a lot of great research already, but also now this more far-flung global community about which there's been relatively little scholarship. So the first goal is simply to lay out that this is happening. And then to think, the project also wants to think a little bit about how this could affect the future of North Korea, the future of any plans for reunification, and what then global and international policies toward the DPRK should be. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to answer follow-up questions, but the book should be coming out sometime early next year, depending on how the COVID production process goes. There's been a little bit of uncertainty on that, and I had hoped the book would be out by now, but it's been a little bit of slow going as we all adapt to the pandemic. So I really look forward to sharing it with everybody in its actual hard or electronic copy early next year. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks so much, Sheena. That sounds like a really fascinating. I lost my headset. That sounds like a really fascinating fascinating book. And like you said, there isn't much literature on this at all, right? There's quite a bit of defector testimony inside of South Korea, and a number of books have been written based on that. But this is something that's very interesting. Can I ask you just one quick follow-up question? You mentioned that Canada is experimenting a little bit with a resettlement effort. Is that something that is being, like, how is that being done? Is that being done by NGO groups? Is there actual legislation like in the United States?
Yeah, it's a great question. So previously, actually one of the largest communities of North Korean expatriates was in the Greater Toronto area and in Canada. And it turned out that most of those were onward migrants from South Korea. So a large number of that community had gone to South Korea first and then decided to move to Canada. And that was the Canadian government initially said it was going to permit people who hadn't been to North Korea first to come, but not people who'd been to South Korea first, but not any others. And then it actually tightened the decision. Ironically, at around the time when it was increasing its refugee cap for migrants or refugees from Syria and elsewhere, the Canadian immigration authorities determined that because there was this option of going to South Korea, North Koreans couldn't come to Canada at all. They weren't going to be considered refugees because they had this alternate citizenship available to them. Now, there's some tension, which the book goes into in more depth and tries to explain between that and what the ROK government's position has been over time. But the result was that at the time, ironically, when it had the most sort of pro-immigrant, pro-refugee rhetoric, the Trudeau administration was issuing deportation notices to North Koreans in Canada. And that was actually one of the things that sparked my interest in, what on earth is going on here and what are the politics of this? Because that seemed like such an incongruous decision to me. So it took about 6 years for civil society advocates and NGOs in Canada to work with the ministers of immigration, the immigration authorities there's a special measure under Canadian law where the Minister of Immigration can say, okay, these people don't meet the standard for refugees under standard Canadian law, but we're going to make an exception. And that exception's been used twice before in Canada's history to allow pilot small-scale resettlement programs. So Han Voice is the civil society organization, the NGO, that is sponsoring the 5 North Korean families for private resettlement. So it requires private sponsorship, it requires an NGO to do much of the heavy lifting, and it's a pilot program. It's only 5 families in the next 2 years. But I know from talking to a lot of the advocates and folks in that community that they're really hoping the program will be successful and can then be made either permanent or institutionalized for a longer period of time. So it works under basically a special pre-existing measure in Canadian law, but it requires a clear group-based determination by the Minister of Immigration. And that just happened recently. It was just announced last month. And the other interesting part of it is that it is, in Canada's case, explicitly focused on women and children, which is, both meets the priorities of the Trudeau government, which has this a very feminist emphasis in its foreign policy and its human rights advocacy. But it's also a good match, frankly, for the North Korean refugee community, which is 70 to 80% female, depending on what year you look at it. But since it's a consistently female population, these are often people who've been subject to some form of gender-based violence or trafficking. It actually is a policy that is sort of a good fit between the Canadian government's priorities and the needs of North Korean refugee populations. So I think this was a case of pretty smart advocacy by the NGO community in Canada. It took 6 years. It was a long process, and having interviewed some of the folks who were involved in it, I just commend them for their patience and determination in getting this through, because I know it wasn't easy, but I do think it's a potential model now that could be used in some other countries who have immigration systems a bit more like Canada's and less like the United States. There are some similarities to the North Korean Human Rights Act, but the private sponsorship model in Canada is quite different and potentially provides a different and a second model for other countries to copy, which I think is a good thing for the people of North Korea. Thanks.
That's fascinating stuff. Okay, now I'd like to go to Professor Andrew Yeo, SK Brookings Korea Chair and Professor at Catholic. Andrew, I know you've done a couple of projects for the lab as well. Would you like to sort of give our audience some insights into what you've been working on?
Sure, Victor, thanks. I just also want to say how delighted I am to be on this panel with you and Sheena, who's seen this project develop over the past few years. I know I've used Sheena as a sounding board multiple times, so that's one of the great things about this lab, that we all have this interest in North Korea and we can bounce off ideas off each other. I'm also grateful, of course, to the Korea Chair, yourself, Victor, and all those at CSIS, and also the Academy of Korean Studies for the logistical and financial support. So again, my gratitude goes out there. Now, in terms of the projects, this project over the 5 years led to 2 academic articles, one which examined people-to-people engagement with North Korea, sadly almost none of which exists today because of the pandemic. And then the other article was a review essay which evaluated how we assess domestic change in North Korea. But like Sheena, I think I'll talk about the penultimate project, which was a short book published by Cambridge University Press earlier this year. And like Sheena, it's through the Elements on East Asian Society and Politics series. So that's now available. But in line with our project theme of understanding the black box of North Korea, the book was a way for me to organize my own thinking about the prospects for domestic change in North Korea, and more specifically, the potential development of civil society. Now, the early stages of the book, I was much more focused on the civil society aspect, but it was clear that there isn't much in the way of an actual civil society. It was going to be a pretty short book. So I shifted direction a bit. So we're looking more now at how markets can shape state-society relations. But back to this question about whether there's a change or not in North Korea. On one hand, there seems to be little change. And we see the Kim family dynasty has outlived almost every current dictatorship in its 70+ years of continuous rule. North Korea is still one of the poorest countries in the world, and it perennially ranks near the bottom of any index on political freedoms, on things like civil liberties, political liberties. But on the other hand, we've heard fascinating accounts of rising markets, the emergence of new capitalists, and the existence of a post-famine generation who crave for more information about the outside world. So on one hand, it sounds like North Korea hasn't changed at all the past 2 decades, but on the other hand, we do hear these stories, these anecdotes about things are changing on the grounds. Now, both narratives may actually be true, and the question of change may depend on what aspect of North Korea or which region of the country one is examining. So from a macro level perspective, it may appear that little has changed about North Korea, but at a micro level, if we go look at this from the bottom up, there is some widespread consensus among North Korea experts about the significant role markets play in North Korea's economy and their importance to state and private actors. The formal and informal markets have become a permanent fixture in what is supposed to be a socialist state. Now, what's up for debate is whether and to what degree markets and things like trade networks have altered state-society relations. The central here is whether expanding markets weaken authoritarian rule. And what's key to my argument is the question of authoritarian legitimacy and how well Kim Jong-un manages to successfully co-opt markets into the regime's ideology. If the regime implements controlled economic measures, extracts rents, and subsumes the market economy into its ideology, the state will likely retain strong authoritarian control. Markets will be beholden to the state, providing the regime much needed revenue, and thereby empowering rather than weakening the state. But in a different hypothesis, or in contrast to that view where state is master over society, if the regime fails to incorporate markets into its legitimating message as private actors build informal trust networks, share information, and collude with state bureaucrats, more fundamental changes in state-society relations are in order. As North Koreans become further dependent on markets for economic survival, the regime's authoritarian grip may weaken as gaps emerge between the regime's ideology and the actual experiences of North Koreans. If markets continue to shift power in favor of private market participants, while at the same time hollowing out the legitimacy of the state, we may begin to see signs of an emerging public sphere. So those are my two contending hypotheses, and I'll say more if we talk more about the pandemic. But for the most part, I think markets are very difficult to control. We've seen the state try to walk back markets, rein in the markets, but most of the time, almost every time they've failed, and so markets have reemerged. But right now we're in a period where, just because of the pandemic, there's just not a lot of flow of goods coming across the border, and so the situation looks pretty grim right now. But in the longer term, I am optimistic that markets will return, and we may see some of these dynamics playing out again. We don't know how long it'll be before North Korea can shake off the effects of this pandemic, but I am more hopeful, at least if we think in the longer term.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Can I ask you, and we will talk about the pandemic and its impact. Can I ask you one follow-up question?
Sure.
Which is, so as you know, we've collected a bunch of data at CSIS with regard to formal markets, the whatever it is, 436 markets, at least as of 2016, 5 years ago, that exist in North Korea. In this study that you've done and the research have you come across any good data about informal markets in North Korea? I know it's very hard to come by. But anything that you've learned about the informal markets in North Korea?
Yeah, most of the information on informal markets, of course, comes from Defectors as well too, and it's hard to, the project that you're referring to that CSIS had done. I remember seeing the coordinates on maps of where these market locations are, and there are other studies that have looked at that, but unfortunately, because of informal markets, they can be anything from just people selling things within their village neighborhood to just on the streets. I haven't seen anything as systematic, but certainly there are anecdotes and there's evidence of markets, informal markets operating in certain cities and certain regions. So along the border regions, this is where informal markets are more prevalent. So we've seen more anecdotal information rather than systematic, but on the whole, we definitely know that informal markets have grown and taken up a larger share of the North Korean economy.
And then the other question quickly is, do we know so we know the government taxes the formal markets. Do we know if they are able to tax the informal markets?
So I was reading, I was reviewing a paper, and someone had mentioned that North Korea can't tax the markets because the informal markets, because it would be recognition that it's a market economy and that there are prices that are actually fixed. So we sometimes call with the formal markets when they make vendors pay, they have to pay a fee, they have to pay a certain maybe percentage of whatever they make in their profits to the state, and we refer to that as a tax, but that's technically not a tax, it's more of a fee. On the informal markets, no, there isn't a tax per se, but if you think of bribery as a form of tax, some think of bribes as just that's the cost of doing business in North Korea. So oftentimes if you're doing these informal markets, maybe you have to pay off border guards, or maybe you have to pay off a security official to be able to sell your goods. And some will say that's the cost of doing business. So you might refer to that as a tax, but there isn't a tax per se that the state can actually impose with these informal markets, at least nothing systematic.
Great. Thanks. Shin, you had a comment in the chat. Do you want to speak to that for the audience's benefit? Yeah.
Sure. So this gets to the question, and Andrew and I have had lots of conversations about what's going on in state-society relations as the North Korean regime tries to regulate markets. And so one of the things I think is really interesting, and I just wanted to pick up on this distinction between the informal and the formal markets, because a lot of the stories that we've seen lately about repression of market activity are actually explicitly directed at these informal or grasshopper markets. And part of our thinking in this paper that I worked on market Leninism picks up and very much builds on Andrew's work to argue that part of what the regime strategy is, right? So Andrew very much looks at this from the perspective of the state society, of civil society, of the civilians who are trying and citizens who are trying to navigate these constraints imposed by the regime. If you look at the regime's policies, it looks a bit like what the North Korean regime is trying to do is to shut down all of the informal market activity, which is more genuine, spontaneous, free market activity, and force it into these regime-controlled markets where it can be regulated so that this and taxed, because that's an effective way of siphoning revenue upward for the North Korean regime, but it also lets them keep closer control of their own agents, who are the people who have been engaged in bribery, coercion, and sometimes abuse of this fee system with the informal markets. So we see some of this as an effort to shift the locus of market activity from the informal markets that are outside regime control to this area where they can be regulated and taxed by the regime. And as Andrew's work, I think, really carefully points out, that has pretty different effects on state-society relations if the markets are formal versus informal. And the potential for markets then to be a politically liberating force get smaller if the regime is able to shift people into these more formal regime-controlled market settings. So it's a part of Andrew's work that I think is really interesting and important, and that we're seeing that distinction, especially under COVID, play out in real time.
Well, I mean, let's talk about that then. I mean, the first is just the theme that resonates from the last panel and in this panel as well is, a lot of the work about understanding North Korea as a black box is, identifying, what are the things that the government can control, what they cannot control, and how they try to wrest control over things that they cannot control. So, this is clearly one of the areas. The other, which we haven't talked about in the context of the work in this project, but that all of you know well, is, the contest that's taking place on the communications technology side, right, between North Korean citizens who are gaining more access to cell phones and SMS texting, and then the government's use of that technology to actually try to control more and monitor more what their citizens are doing. But can we move to the because both of you have sort of skirted around it, but let's talk about sort of the impact of the pandemic and what it's done. I guess the question is what it's done to markets, and then and how it's impacted the government strategy in markets, how it's impacted society. So I don't know who'd like to go first.
I can take that first, Sheena,
Okay.
if you don't mind. So there's much greater optimism about markets empowering society in the early mid 2010s, when money was flowing, when the donjus, the money masters and new capitalists were thriving in a pre-pandemic, pre-heavy sanctions era. But North Korean watchers, myself included, have I said I was more optimistic in the longer term, post-pandemic, but there's also less optimism now just about things like societal change or economic change, and it stems from almost 2 years of heavy border lockdowns, and we've also seen the regime crack down on the spread of capitalist and outside cultural influence. There's a tightening of ideological indoctrination as well too. So what that means for the markets is that there's just a lot less goods, money that's flowing, that's circulating in North Korea, and even things like goods for food production like fertilizer, seeds, grain. There's a shortage of this, and right now there's a humanitarian crisis that's ongoing in North Korea, and so when you talk about markets, it's the pandemic itself. It's the people are suffering, but as I think John had mentioned, John Deluri had mentioned in the first panel, these are also things that Kim Jong-un has confessed that he doesn't have control over, and it must be frustrating for the leadership as well. And they're doing the best that they can to try to control the situation. Shin has written about this as well too, about the state trying to centralize economic authority once again, and really to clamp down, rein in the markets. This has been going on even before the pandemic, but since the pandemic, they've really tightened their grip on the markets, trying to take control of the economy again. And so even though the market has shrunk just naturally because of the pandemic, I think the state has become less open to it. And that's what I mentioned, where we see periods of the markets opening and then the regime clamping down or cracking down again on markets. And we're in this period where I think the state is really trying to clamp down on this. And whether that's because of the pandemic or whether the state is using the pandemic as an excuse to really tighten its authority, I mean, that's up for debate. But yeah, it is a grim situation right now in North Korea.
Sheena?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say I think we see a couple of different effects on the pandemic, and certainly it has made research on global politics in general pretty challenging in the last couple of years. But in terms of the effect on North Korean migration, North Korean refugees, the North Korean diaspora, I think, what we've seen is that North Korea is maybe an extreme case, but fits a broader global pattern of what some of my colleagues in a forthcoming paper at International Security called opportunistic repression. And their paper looks at semi-authoritarian or authoritarian regimes in Africa who found in the pandemic and a reason and a pretext to do some things that they might have already wanted to do in terms of strengthening political control. But the pandemic provided a reason to assume emergency powers, to put a lot of power into executive hands, meaning the sort of the core leadership, in many cases an autocrat or a dictator, and then to really crack down on society, including targeting political opponents under the guise of these public health emergency measures. In North Korea's case, that's meant limits on internal mobility, which was one of the things that made market activity possible and allowed information to circulate more freely, and really tight border control. And so the effect has been really to decimate the number of, in the literal sense, right, down to 10% of what, or less of what it once was, the number of North Koreans who are able to leave North Korea, particularly via China. North Korea was already one of the authoritarian regimes in the international system that limited emigration the most. There are some non-democracies that actually do allow citizens to leave a fair amount and return to the country, and it is still politically controlled and calibrated, but there's a lot more mobility. North Korea has never been one of those, and the pandemic has really tanked the number of people who've been able to escape North Korea. I think in the last quarter, the number of North Koreans arriving in South Korea for resettlement was in single digits. which is really tragic when it's coupled with the humanitarian crisis that Andrew mentioned, the food shortages, the loss of cross-border trade with China, which was an economic lifeline for so many people, particularly in the northern parts of North Korea. And so I think the effect of the pandemic has been not only to exacerbate the internal humanitarian crisis that Andrew spoke about, but also to limit the ability of North Koreans to leave in search of not only political freedom, but in some cases literal physical survival. And to me, that's hugely concerning, and the potential for just human tragedy there is really troubling and concerning. We do see that in the case of the North Korean diaspora, part of this book project involved a survey of North Koreans in the United States, which we tried to mirror some of the work that had been done in South Korea so we could compare responses. And we still saw that between 30 and 40% of people were in touch with family or friends, some sort of contact inside North Korea, or had been able to send something. But the cost of using a broker to get across the border has gone way up, and it's gotten much harder to communicate or send food, medicine, money, information, and so it's also attenuated the relationship between the North Koreans who have escaped abroad and the family members that they still have inside North Korea, which is again just I think a really tragic consequence of pandemic politics.
Great, both of you. I have a question for each of you. Follow-up question for Sheena. You mentioned that the number of North Koreans that are making their way into South Korea has dwindled quite a bit, and that certainly may have to do with opportunistic repression. But if you could also comment on sort of whether and if so, how the South Korean government's policies with regard to North Korean human rights has or has not affected that flow of people. And then for Andrew, if I'm curious to know your thoughts on the extent to which this border lockdown with China, which is now now going on to like 23 months now, has impacted how that has impacted the markets. I've heard different stories anecdotally about how it's impacted the markets, but and it looked like we had some imagery last week that was featured in the Financial Times that showed that they looked like they were going to try to start to open up the border with China by converting an airbase into a storage facility. A storage quarantine facility, but that looks like it may all be on hold now because of this new variant of the virus. But if you could sort of what's in your estimation, how has this border lockdown affected the market? So maybe I'll go to Andrew first.
Sure. Well, as many of the North Korean watching community knows, 90 up to 95% of trade. North Korean trade comes from China. So when you have a border lockdown and nothing's coming in and out, you can imagine what sort of effect that would have for North Korea, for North Korean markets. When the majority of goods that you get are coming from one country, and then there's a hard lockdown, that should say something about markets itself. But we've seen these signals where reports that trade with North Korea has gone up, and so maybe we're seeing that North Koreans ease markets. I remember the CSIS report as well too. It looked like they were getting ready to maybe open one segment of the border to allow more shipments, but then things the following month it doesn't materialize, and it's one of these questions. And going back to the theme of understanding the black box, what is Kim Jong-un thinking? How much longer can the country persist without borders opening up to a certain extent? So that's where you get questions, things about, is the regime going to be stable in another year or so? Is it going to have to make some kind of changes, or will that change the calculus of the Kim regime to maybe try to negotiate with the U.S. or engage South Korea again. And I mean, your guess is as good as mine, because you would think that they would be at a point where they would want, certainly they want the sanctions relief, but they're still holding on, and so it leads to these questions of what is driving the Kim regime's calculus. You would think that at least having a vaccination strategy would then be an answer to trying to ease the border lockdowns, but that hasn't been the case as well. The flip side of this, of course, is some say that the regime is still able to survive because it can somehow evade sanctions, or in terms of the illicit economy or illicit goods, that things are still getting into the country illegally, maybe through. Sheena may know more about this, but I don't know what the port situation looks like, if they've opened any ports, but there may be ways to smuggle things through, but again, those sort of stories are also anecdotal, so it's really hard to know. The elites tend to thrive, through illegal sanctions evasions and through the illicit economy. I don't know to what extent that holds true in a situation when there's a strict border lockdown, but it may be possible that that it's actually because of markets, or at least the illegal markets, illicit trade, that North Koreans are still able to, the regime at least is still able to stay afloat.
Thanks, Andrew. Sheena?
Yeah, just as a follow-up on that point, I think the North Korean regime's shift toward cyber revenue generating operations was well-timed, because it actually was in place prior to the pandemic. And so I think the leadership, my sense is that the leadership has a potential source of revenue that we were, a little bit slow to catch on to. I know there was some good work out of CSIS on this, but overall, there was this shift toward the regime attempting to earn revenue through cyber operations, which don't necessarily require a lot of physical border crossing and travel. So in some sense, the regime, came into the pandemic with that potential advantage. Now, obviously, there have still been constraints imposed by sanctions in the pandemic, but I actually think in some ways the border control has hit ordinary people in North Korea harder, because they were just more dependent on physical border crossing of goods and people. And so I think it's important to sort of just, bracket that cyber point. On the question of ROK policy and how it's shaped the North Korean diaspora, that's a great question. One of the papers that I did for the lab looked at North Korean migration experiences, and it looked at what happened. We disaggregated the migration process for North Koreans who have ended up in South Korea. We actually did this using a collection of, there are almost 200 over 200 North Korean, almost 200 is more correct, North Korean members of the diaspora who have left and written a memoir in either English or Korean. And we went through and systematically coded all of those and looked at what happened to people during different stages of their migration journey. And one of the things that we found is that often their first encounter with the South Korean government was not when they actually got to the physical territory of the ROK. It was abroad, going to a consulate, going to an embassy, asking a Korean citizen of the ROK who happened to be in Canada or a third country for help. And a lot of them reported actually that those initial requests for help were not successful, that there were cases where they, legally and in terms of ethnic identity, right, thought of themselves as Korean. They expected that the South Korean government would treat them as citizens, which is the, South Korean law treats North Koreans as citizens. But when they approached embassies or consulates abroad, they often weren't given the same rights or status that someone already holding an ROK passport would have been. And so from, you can talk about it at the level of policy, but at the level of individual migrant and refugee experience, they didn't feel fully equal members of the of South Korea, of the South Korean polity. And that actually extended all the way through the process of being debriefed by the National Intelligence Service, and then the 3-month period in which they were at Hanwon. So what was interesting about that, I think that process of not necessarily knowing whether you can count on the South Korean state to include you if you're not already in South Korea, actually has a really important effect, in particular on some of the folks who chose to go to the United States. Because we saw that there were two things that were sort of consistent themes when we asked people, why did you choose to come to the US? And some of our respondents had actually been to South Korea first and then came to the United States to study or to work or for temporary purposes. And some of them were refugees who had gone through the process outlined by the North Korean Human Rights Act. And so we looked at both groups. But consistently, people said it was a sense that there was greater economic and social opportunity in the United States. But a secondary theme really was a desire to avoid what they saw as the potential for discrimination and a lack of socioeconomic mobility in the ROK itself. And I know that's something that ROK policy has tried to grapple with, but it seems to be an ongoing issue, at least judging from our survey results, and is part of why you see people choosing to seek other countries as resettlement destinations. And then I think the final point is that we also in the survey tried to disentangle what is it that somebody who's come from an authoritarian system like North Korea thinks is important about democratic citizenship. I think this is a fascinating question with a lot to teach all of us right now as we grapple with questions about what American democracy should look like and global democracy. But one of the things that came up very strongly in the survey results is that people who've left North Korea really prioritize what we would call a civil libertarian notion of democratic citizenship. So overwhelmingly, like off the charts, people will say that the purpose of a democratic government is to provide people with their individual rights and freedoms. So very strong emphasis on civil liberties. And that's kind of at odds with the approach taken, at least in some cases, by the Moon government, where it's those kinds of activities, freedom of speech, freedom to send information, freedom to do balloon launches, that have been constricted by some of the policies that this administration has taken. I know there was some discussion of that earlier, but I would just note that we now have some evidence that there's a real sort of structure of democratic citizenship that North Korean people who've left North Korea prioritize, that where civil liberties are really important. And so to the extent that there is any hint of not having a very expansive tolerance for and protection for civil liberties by any government, that's going to run into or be at odds with the way that North Koreans think about, what's important about freedom and democracy. And the book, again, we try to disaggregate that and explore it in a little more detail in the book manuscript.
Right, really interesting stuff. So we have a little bit of time and there's questions from the audience. So the first question is, and I think both of you can comment on this. With women dominating market trade in North Korea, how does their participation interact with pre-existing gender norms? And what is the impact on reshaping of social relations and civil society within the country?
Yeah, I know Sheena could take that one too, but I just unmuted myself. So let me take a stab at that. That's absolutely correct that women are dominating the markets, and it's especially when it comes to the informal markets and the 장마당, because men have to work in their state, in their state jobs, the jobs that they're required to work in, whereas women, especially if they stay at home, have extra time, so they're able to work in the markets. And there is recognition within North Korea society of women becoming, the breadwinners or women making money. And there's actually a great podcast on NK News with Hannah Song, who directs NK North Korea database NKDB, who they just came out with a report on the household and the effects that markets are having on women. And so she talks about some of the dynamics of the social relations between husbands and wives, and there's this tension because there is a recognition that women are becoming breadwinners, but yet North Korea is still a patriarchal society, and so that leads to tensions. In terms of civil society, if you think about women working in markets, I've thought about this a lot, and I've talked about this with a couple colleagues that I wrote a report about markets and civil society building blocks. Justin Hastings at University of Sydney and Dan Wirtz, who was with NCNK, and we tried to explore whether women are, these women are forming informal trust networks. When you work in a market, you have to have information. You have to know about prices of goods. You have to know, who's selling what, and that means that you have to talk to one another. And we wondered if that would naturally lead to conversations among women. The rise of a public sphere of sorts as women interact. And we actually even wondered whether things like the women's union, if that you're required to meet 2 times a week in this association, but what purpose does it serve for women? Or on the sidelines, are they going to be chatting about their market activity? So we actually do think that there's a lot of potential there. And so things like entrepreneurship, if women want to know, how do I start a business? You're not going to ask the state, how do I begin my own business? You're going to ask someone who's had that experience before. So again, this is women speaking and talking informally, and it's not being regulated by the state. And so again, we're seeing, this is what we mean by the building blocks of civil society. As these informal trust networks are working, as women are having conversations with one another about markets, but maybe about other stuff, maybe about the weather, maybe about gossip, maybe about a South Korean drama, who knows? Of course, that's getting more dangerous. But to us, that is the early trappings of a civil society, when you can get people to begin talking and have discourse that's not intervened by the state. So just some thoughts about women and markets and civil society.
Great, Shin, I'll give you the last word.
I would just second, a lot of what Andrew has said about the changing dynamics in North Korea itself. As it relates to migration, obviously this gives North Korean women more opportunity to cross the border as part of economic activity, but then also places them at increased risk for trafficking and gender-based violence. And comparatively, one of the really interesting things that I don't think we have a great handle on is that I don't think there's been a diaspora where it's predominantly women and children and so many single mothers. And so I think that raises all sorts of really interesting questions about resettlement policy, but also about sort of patterns of political engagement. And part of why we've seen some of the defectors who have become advocates really focus on women's rights. So lots of interesting questions that I think we're just now starting to explore, and would be great areas for people to keep researching and looking into, because they're fascinating and we don't have full answers yet.
Thanks. Well, this is a terrific discussion, and I feel like we've only hit the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more that we could talk about, but unfortunately, we're at the end of our time. So I want to thank Andrew and Sheena for a very interesting discussion about North Korean market society, the diaspora, things that we don't, in sort of the national security-based discussion around Washington, D.C., we don't talk enough about, because that's probably where there's the most change that will come in North Korea, inside the black box. So again, there's clearly much more that we could talk about, but that is why the audience can look up your research on our website, which we've put up all the work that you've done there. They can certainly learn more from that. I want to thank Andrew Yo, Sheena Chestnut-Greitens, Bridget Kajins, Seongho Shin, and John Delury for joining us today. I want to thank Seon-ji, who's not on the screen, but she was the person who's been leading us all in this big lab effort. Thank her for all her work in keeping us, herding us cats, and keeping us all together. Thanks again to CSIS and the Academy for Korean Study for their support of the work of these scholars. And best wishes to our scholars for the rest of your research. I know that all of you are still very much deeply in different stages of the work, and we wish you the best of luck there. And finally, to our audience, thank you for tuning in. best wishes for the holiday season, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you.